There's a theory that John Wayne Gacy was part of a larger trafficking ring, that he did not act alone in his crimes. He said he was part of a wider organized network of individuals who trafficked and abused young men and boys. Proponents of this theory argue that it was improbable for Gacy to have committed all 33 murders by himself. They point to evidence such as witness testimony from a survivor who believed others were present during his assault, receipts suggesting that Gacy was out of town when some of the victims disappeared, and also the fact that Gacy had connections to high-profile criminals and organized rings. It's important to realize that no one is arguing that Gacy was not guilty for the crimes that he committed. And in fact, he was very guilty for these crimes. However, the argument behind this theory is that he had accomplices and was part of a larger ring that helped him and committed further crimes. John Wayne Gacy has connections with a mass murderer named Dean Corll and a notorious trafficker named John David Norman. The claim is that these men were all part of a sophisticated nationwide ring that procured victims and shared connections, allowing them to operate for years without being caught by leveraging a network that included prominent members of society. This is the John Wayne Gacy trafficking theory. Let's get spooky. Hey, spooky people, it's your best friend Kenny, and we are back with another spooky and disturbing story. Before we get to today's story, let's make sure that you're subscribed to this channel, The Spooky Lawyer. Please like, share, hit the hype button, and leave a comment to help me in the algorithm. Thank you. The official story is that John Wayne Gacy was a monstrous solitary predator, that he was a lone wolf, and this was the foundation of the 1980 prosecution. It was maintained by the primary investigators and prosecutors and remains the definitive historical record of the case. The case against John Wayne Gacy crystallized in December 1978 with the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Paske. Police surveillance led to Gacy, a suburban building contract and community volunteer known for dressing up as Pogo the Clown. Clowns. Upon questioning, Gacy began jabbering about a 7-year career of murder. The search of his home at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue revealed a horror that would catapult Gacy to the top of the serial killer pantheon. Police discovered 26 bodies in a 40-foot crawl space, 1 body under his dining room, and 2 buried in his backyard. 4 additional victims were recovered from the Des Plaines River. In 1980, Gacy was tried and convicted of 33 counts of murder. The trial itself wasn't your typical whodunit. Gacy's culpability was conceded by his own legal team. The defense, which was led by Sam Amirante, instead used the insanity defense, arguing that Gacy was not legally responsible for his actions. This strategy came from Gacy's own prison yard manipulations, where he waffled between confessions and claims that an alter ego named Jack Hanley had committed the killings. The trial became a contest over Gacy's mind, not his potential associations. The prosecution, which was led by William Kunkel, needed to prove Gacy was sane and solely responsible. The defense needed to prove he was insane. This led to both the prosecution and the defense focusing exclusively on Gacy. Neither the defense nor the prosecution had any interest in introducing a complex accomplice theory because it would have undermined the goals of both sides. Therefore, the lone wolf framework became the uncontested piece of the trial. The jury only deliberated for an hour and 50 minutes and found Gacy guilty on all 33 counts, validating the prosecution's narrative of a single calculating predator. An hour and 50 minutes is a very short time for 33 counts. That basically means they read the jury form and they just checked all the boxes and found him guilty. That is a very short time to deliberate for any jury, much less a jury where there is 33 counts. The Lone Wolf story was authored by 3 principal figures in the case. Prosecutor William J. Kunkel. As the lead prosecutor, Kunkel's public stance has been the most forceful and consistent. His incredible, devastating closing argument portrayed Gacy as a singular, sadistic, and calculating killing machine who planned it in advance and he carried it out and he enjoyed it. Since then, Kunkel has consistently dismissed Gacy's prison claims of accomplices as the desperate manipulative acts of a sociopath facing execution. Terry Sullivan, who is another key prosecutor, co-authored the seminal 1983 book Killer Clown, The John Wayne Gacy Murders. This book was sold as a shocking eyewitness account from inside the heart of a serial murder investigation and trial. It meticulously reconstructs the manhunt for Gacy. It detailed the gruesome discovery and the subsequent legal strategy, solidifying the Gacy-centric narrative. Chief Investigator Joseph Kozanczak was the chief of detectives for the Des Plaines Police Department and the lead investigator who broke the case. His career and legacy became defined by the Gacy investigation. He would write a book in 1992, The Chicago Killer, The Hunt for Serial Killer John Wayne Gacy. It would frame the case as a hunt for a single killer, cementing this lone wolf story from the law enforcement perspective. These 3 men became the authors. Literally, two of them were actual authors of the official Gacy narrative. Their legacies are linked to their defined roles in capturing this singular monster. This created a powerful resistance to any reevaluation of the case that suggests that they missed a wider network or that the investigation was incomplete. Despite the legal finality of the 1980 verdict, significant doubts challenged the lone wolf story. These doubts are rooted in logistical questions, alibi evidence, and the direct testimony of a surviving victim, as well as Gacy's connections with other criminals. The sheer scale of the crimes presented a logistical challenge for one man. Gacy was convicted of 33 murders with 26 victims buried in a cramped 40-foot crawl space of his home. Gacy was a large man, and he doesn't look like he was in very good shape. The act of maneuvering, burying, and concealing over 24 150-ish pound bodies in such a confined space is a task that would require enormous time and effort. This logistical doubt is compounded by a chilling piece of evidence. One of Gacy's victims, Gregory Godzik, who was an employee at Gacy's PDM Contractors, told his family he was digging trenches under Gacy's house before he ended up in one. This blurs the line between Gacy's legitimate business and the mechanics of his serial murders. It suggests Gacy was actively using his employees to perform the labor required. The pool, which was also the pool that he selected his victims from, to perform the labor required to conceal his crimes. The most significant evidence supporting an accomplice theory is based on Gacy's own travel receipts. Gacy was verifiably out of state when at least two of the victims buried in the crawl space disappeared. Robert Gilroy disappeared in September 1977, and there are receipts showing that Gacy was in Pittsburgh during this period. John Mowry disappeared later in September 1977, and there are reportedly receipts showing that Gacy was at a job in Michigan at the time. These receipts, crucial element of the theory that Gacy did not act alone. Objective third-party records. A man can't be in Pittsburgh and Chicago simultaneously. This requires then that at least one person had the access, motive, and complicity to lure, murder, and bury victims in Gacy's crawl space. It shatters the lone wolf story completely. Jeffrey Rignell is an exception in the Gacy case. He's a survivor. In March 1977, Gacy enticed a 27-year-old into his car, rendered him unconscious with chloroform, handcuffed him, and SA'd him at his house. Gacy then dumped the barely conscious Rignell in Lincoln Park. Rignell detailed his experience in a book called 29 Below. He stated, he thought someone else was in Gacy's house when he was tortured. He claims he remembers seeing a teenaged male watching while Gacy tortured him. This is a key part of the accomplice theory. The police's response to Rignell's report was disturbing. Gacy was charged with a misdemeanor and the case was dismissed. An official familiar with the case explained why, stating it was a one-on-one situation with Gacy's word against the kids. There were no witnesses. The police, faced with a complaint from a young man against an established model citizen and business owner, defaulted to believing Gacy. This one-on-one dismissal demonstrates the systemic failure and the prejudice that made a network investigation impossible. The homophobic bias allowed Gacy to continue his murders for another 20 months. Gacy himself is a source for the accomplice theory. From the moment of his arrest, he attempted to deflect blame and implicate others. After he was arrested, Gacy reportedly asked police, "Who else do you have in the station? There are others involved," and claimed his associates were directly involved. In a 1992 interview with Walter Jacobson, Gacy claimed he had accomplices, this time blaming his employees for the murders. These claims are dismissed by the prosecution as the self-serving waffling of a sociopath attempting to evade execution. However, when viewed in light of the alibi receipt evidence and Rignell's testimony, Gacy's deflections, although they could be completely manipulative and likely were completely manipulative, may have been the case of a guilty man attempting to spread the blame he shared. Gacy's construction business, PDM Contractors, was the epicenter of his criminal world. It served as his primary hunter ground, providing him with a steady stream of young men and boys to target. The core of this theory, that Gacy had accomplices, argues that these men were not just victims or witnesses, but active participants. Gacy's testimony is unreliable, but he named 3 unemployees: Michael Rossi, David Cram, and Philip Paske. These 3 are the focus of modern investigations into the Gacy case. Gacy contended that all 3 had keys to his house. This gives them direct access to the property in the crawl space. Rossi and Cram were teenage employees of PDM, and it is speculated that they were also sexually involved with Gacy. This suggests a level of intimacy and control that blurs the line between employee and cult-like follower. Both Rossi and Paske used Gacy's own clown alias, Patches, for themselves. This is sort of a shared identity inside joke, but it also shows that this is far beyond a typical employer-employee relationship. The accomplice theory was long dismissed by officials as unsubstantiated. However, the 2021 Peacock docuseries John Wayne Gacy, Devil in Disguise provided a potential motive for why the theory was never pursued by investigators. In interviews from the series, prosecutor Terry Sullivan admitted that Gacy's named accomplice, Michael Rossi, had a grandfather who was a powerful alderman named Vito Marzullo. In the Chicago political landscape of the 1970s, the power of a long-serving old guard alderman like Vito Marzullo was immense. An investigation that threatened to pull his grandson into the most sensational mass murder case in U.S. history could have been politically catastrophic for the police and the state's attorney's office. They would have faced overwhelming pressure not to follow that lead. The lone wolf story may have been a political necessity. It allowed the state to contain the scandal to the socially and politically expendable figure of Gacy, preventing the case from exploding into a full-blown scandal that could have implicated the powerful Chicago political machine. Gacy had a disturbing connection to another one of Chicago's most notorious killers, Robin Gecht, the leader of the Chicago Ripper Crew. Gecht worked for John Wayne Gacy as a construction subcontractor. Gecht's Ripper Crew was a four-man, satanic-worshipping gang that, in 1981 and 1982, was suspected in the disappearance of 18 women. They were convicted for a series of horrific crimes involving the SA, torture, mutilation, and cannibalization of their victims. Official sources are quick to state that no criminal connection has ever been established between Gacy and Gecht. Their victim profiles and MOs were starkly different. Gacy went after young men and boys, Gecht went after women. However, the lone wolf stereotype is often a socially isolated individual. Gacy was the opposite. He was a model citizen and a social hub. His PDM Contractors was a magnet for a specific deviant type of person. He employed troubled teens like Rossi and Cram. Paske was a convicted murderer and producer of CSAM, and Gecht was a future sadistic mass murderer. Gacy did not hide from this dark, disturbing world. He curated it. This clustering of predators and career criminals within one small-time construction business makes the idea that Gacy kept his real self a complete secret from them pretty improbable. Paske is a direct link between John Wayne Gacy and a notorious nationwide sex trafficker, John David Norman. Paske worked for Gacy's PDM Contractors. Gacy named Paske as an accomplice and claimed that Paske pimped girls, boys for sex or movies. Paske was the closest associate and right-hand man of John David Norman. They met in jail in 1973. Paske worked for Norman, and police alleged Paske had taken over running Norman's Delta Project, which was his Chicago operation, after Norman was in prison. John David Norman was a convicted sex offender who operated multiple nationwide direct mailing services dedicated to distributing CSAM and arranging trafficking. His operations include the Odyssey Foundation in Dallas and the Delta Project in Chicago. Norman was not a serial killer, but a facilitator who industrialized the exploitation of children through a series of front organizations disguised as charitable foundations. His ability to operate for decades, utilizing many different aliases, speaks to a high degree of adaptability and the fact that his operation had operational security. The Odyssey Foundation was the Texas logistical hub. In the early 1970s, Norman established the Odyssey Foundation in Dallas, Texas. It was to appear as a youth outreach program designed to provide educational, travel, and self-development opportunities. The foundation functioned as the procurement mechanism for a nationwide trafficking ring. The operational model for the Odyssey Foundation was efficient. It involved recruiting teenage boys, often runaways or those from marginalized backgrounds, under the guise of offering employment or mentorship. These victims, referred to in Norman's internal documentation as fellows or cadets, were cataloged and trafficked to wealthy clients known as sponsors across the United States. The Odyssey Foundation utilized a direct mailing service to distribute CSAM and advertise the availability of these victims. Norman's system was a catalog service for human beings. You heard that right. He maintained a filing system of tens of thousands of index cards to manage his client list, which allegedly included prominent figures in the government and society. This approach to exploitation suggests a level of organization that far exceeds the capabilities of a solitary predator. Norman provided the logistical backbone for a market in which other violent offenders could participate. The foundation's brochure promised character and integrity, an irony that masked the systemic grooming and transportation of minors to sponsors who paid for their company for 1 to 3 days before the boys were moved to the next location. Following legal troubles in Texas, Norman shifted his base of operations to Chicago, Illinois, where he established the Delta Project. The Delta Project mirrored the Odyssey Foundation's structure, but with increased security and a broader reach. It was headquartered in an apartment on West Wrightwood Avenue, and the Delta Project continued the foster care ruse, housing young men in Delta Dorm, where they were groomed for exploitation. The Delta Dorm's concept was a key to the ring's sustainability. Dormitories were established in private residences in various states, where an adult male member of the ring, designed as a Don, would house 2 to 4 cadets. The Don acted under the pretense of a guardian or manager, often promising the boys stability. In reality, the Don exploited the boys and facilitated their trafficking to other members of the network. This structure allowed the ring to operate in plain sight, embedding itself in residential neighborhoods, providing a steady supply of victims who were dependent on the traffickers for housing and food, making them less likely to run away or contact the police. Norman's ability to run this network was not affected by being in jail. While he was detained in Cook County Jail in the mid-1970s, Norman continued to produce and distribute his newsletter, using the jail's own printing facilities. The newsletter solicited funds for his defense and advertised the continued operations of the trafficking ring. The fact that a known PDF file could operate a national trafficking newsletter from within a major correction facility suggests either a catastrophic breakdown in oversight or active corruption that was facilitating his enterprise. Complicity. Norman also had a handy-andy operation in Pennsylvania, another iteration of his mailing and distribution network. Norman fled to Pennsylvania after a raid on his home on May 30th, 1984, but was later captured in Illinois, illustrating a pattern of moving between these specific geographical hubs. The multi-state presence included Texas, Illinois, Pennsylvania, California, and Colorado. It shows that his infrastructure was nationwide. It was a nationwide pipeline. This is critical because it aligns with the travel patterns and profiles of Gacy, suggesting that lone killers may have been utilizing or feeding into a pre-existing interstate infrastructure. Norman's ring was recorded on tens of thousands of pink index cards seized during raids on his Chicago apartment. These cards contained the names of customers and sponsors, estimated between 20,000 and 100,000 distinct entries. Reports indicated that the index cards seized in Dallas were sent to Washington, D.C. and ultimately destroyed by the Department of State. Similarly, the client lists seized in Chicago have never been made public, and attempts to access them have been stopped. The destruction or suppression of this evidence suggests a containment strategy by authorities. If the Delta Project's client list included powerful figures, the prosecution of a lone nut like Gacy or a low-level operator like Paske served to satisfy public demand for justice while protecting the network's elite clientele. The destruction of evidence prevented the mapping of a full network. Had the cards been cross-referenced with the travel logs of Gacy and the missing persons reports of the area, the full extent of the Delta conspiracy might have been laid bare. The case of Dean Corll, known as the Candyman, is typically framed as a localized horror story involving a man and his two teenage accomplices, Elmer Wayne Henley and David Owen Brooks. However, an analysis of witness testimony and physical evidence reveals that Corll likely operated as a procurement agent for the broader network of the Odyssey Foundation. From the onset of the investigation into the Houston mass murders, Corll's accomplices provided explicit testimony regarding a larger operation. Both Henley and Brooks independently informed law enforcement that Corll was not acting alone but was involved with a syndicate based in Dallas. According to Henley, Corll claimed participation in a white slavery ring where teenage boys were sold as houseboys to wealthy clients across the country. Corll detailed a pricing structure to Henley, offering a bounty of $200 for any teenage boy he could lure to the apartment. Prosecutors treated these statements as Corll's mechanism for manipulating his accomplices, but the Dallas origin and the syndicate terminology aligns with the known operations of Odyssey Foundation, which was headquartered in Dallas during the exact period of Corll's spree. Corll repeatedly referred to the topic of human trafficking, informing Henley that such a market does exist. The timing between the exposure of Dean Corll's crimes and the collapse of John David Norman's Dallas operation is probably not a coincidence. Dean Corll was shot and killed by Henley on August 8, 1973, leading to the discovery of the mass graves. Just 1 week later, on August 15, 1973, investigators in Dallas raided the apartment of John David Norman, uncovering the nationwide procurement ring. The death of Corll and the subsequent media frenzy likely triggered the collapse or frantic cleaning of associated nodes within the network. Despite this, the Dallas Police Department and the Houston Police Department failed to publicly link the two events. Captain Benny Newman, who was commander of the Houston Police Youth Division, explicitly stated there was no known connection between Norman's operations and Corll's murders. This dismissal, issued before a comprehensive cross-jurisdiction analysis was completed, was a significant investigation failure. The most compelling physical evidence linking Corll to Norman's network emerged 2 years after Corll's death. In 1975, a police raid on a sex trafficking ring in Houston uncovered a massive amount of CSAM that included photographs of 11 of Dean Corll's victims. This contradicts the idea that Corll was an isolated killer. These images suggest that Corll was documenting his captives for distribution or sale within the network, not just personal trophies. The 1975 raid raises the possibility of a connection to John David Norman. The police at the time declined to pursue this link, citing a desire to spare the victims' families further trauma, effectively burying the evidence of the larger conspiracy. Remember, John Wayne Gacy is linked to Norman through Philip Paske. He's an undeniable bridge between Gacy and Norman. Paske served as John David Norman's closest associate and right-hand man within the Delta Project. Paske was convicted of a 1973 robbery murder in Chicago. Following his incarceration in Cook County Jail, which is where he met Norman, Paske was released and immediately integrated into the leadership of the Delta Project. Norman's own defense fund reportedly used to secure Paske's release in July 1976, highlighting that Paske was valuable to the operation. Employment records and Gacy's own admissions confirm that Philip Paske was employed by John Wayne Gacy's construction firm, PDM Contractors. Pay stubs from September 1978 explicitly list Paske as an employee of Gacy. This is a direct link. A known leader of a nationwide boy trafficking ring was working daily with the nation's most prolific killer of teenage boys during Gacy's killing spree. And Gacy's awareness of Paske's background is documented. In interviews, Gacy described Paske as dangerous. The fact that Gacy retained Paske as employee despite, or maybe even because of, this knowledge suggests a relationship that was symbiotic. PDM Contractors, with it constantly bringing in young male laborers, offered a perfect cover for the recruitment of potential victims for Delta Project dorms. The relationship between Gacy and Paske was facilitated by other employees of PDM Contractors, specifically David Cram and Michael Rossi, who were also both implicated by Gacy's accomplices. Remember, Gacy said that Rossi, Cram, and Paske all had keys to his house. Paske's role in the Delta Project involved managing the Delta dorms, and his employment with Gacy provided a legitimate front. He was eventually fired from the job as a children's supervisor at a swimming pool in 1977 after being publicly linked to a trafficking ring. Yet, Gacy continued to employ him into 1978. Again, this suggests that Paske's value to Gacy was outweighed by reputation, and it was likely due to Paske's ability in procuring victims or disposing of evidence. In a 1992 prison interview, Gacy explicitly implicated Norman and Paske in a commercial enterprise that went beyond simple trafficking. Gacy claimed that the Delta Project was producing films of young boys and suggested that some of his own victims may have been utilized in these productions. Gacy stated they were making films with young boys. To me, they were pimping them off. They were selling them. It suggests that Gacy viewed himself not just as a killer, but as a participation in this market economy of violence. This claim provides a terrifying rationale for the volume of victims. If the murders were being recorded for sale by Norman's network, the value of each victim extended beyond Gacy's immediate gratification. The sheer volume of Gacy's victims, 33 that are known, and Corll's victims, 28 plus known, supports an industrial motivation rather than an impulsive one. The Gacy and Corll cases through the Norman network suggest an evolution in the understanding of serial murder victimology. In both cases, the victims were predominantly young males, often in the age range of 14 to 21. The Gacy Trafficking Ring Theory explains geographic anomalies in the victimology of Gacy. Gacy's associated with Chicago, but his travel logs indicate a presence in Colorado and other states where Norman operated. The recent work of Detective Sergeant Jason Moran of the Cook County Sheriff's Office, who reopened the Gacy cold case in 2011, has utilized DNA technology to identify victims who were not local to Chicago. For example, the identification of Francis Wayne Alexander and James Hawkinson involved tracing missing persons from states far removed from Illinois. The fact that Gacy's victims originated from across the country aligns with this Delta Project interstate trafficking. These young men were not merely picked up hitchhiking. They were likely moving along a pipeline of safe houses or dorms that eventually deposited them at Gacy's door. This was an organized multi-state criminal enterprise. This is the larger trafficking kidnapping ring. The trafficking ring reframes Gacy's entire operation. The lone wolf story explains Gacy's crimes as purely psychosexual. The trafficking narrative suggests economic motives. In this light, PDM Contractors was not just a lure, it was a front and a recruitment agency for the Delta Project. The murders are more complex. Some were undoubtedly for Gacy's personal sadistic pleasure, but others, especially the ones for which he had an alibi, could have been acts committed by the network or cleanup operations to silence witnesses to the trafficking. This reframes the Gacy case as a mass homicide with a hidden human trafficking component. It also expands the network to a nationwide scale, linking Gacy, the killer clown, with Houston serial killer Dean Corll, the Candyman, and his teenage accomplices Elmer Wayne Henley and David Allen Brooks, suggests that they're both connected to the same nationwide trafficking network run by John David Norman. Remember, Corll's accomplice, Elmer Wayne Henley, told police of a syndicate in Dallas that trafficked boys. John David Norman's Odyssey Foundation was based in Dallas. Gacy's associate, Philip Paske, was John David Norman's right-hand man. This reframes Gacy and Corll as suppliers, clients, and or enforcers for a single, vast PDF file and trafficking enterprise. This leads to the most catastrophic investigative failure of the 1978 investigation. The data shows police were running two parallel investigations in Chicago at the same time. The Gacy serial murders and the John David Norman Norman Delta Project trafficking ring. In 1978, Philip Paske was at Norman's apartment when Norman was arrested for his trafficking operation, but Paske was not arrested. In 1978, Philip Paske was the employee of John Wayne Gacy. In 1979, Philip Paske was listed as a potential witness for the prosecution and the defense at the Gacy trial. This means that the police and prosecutors had simultaneous contact with the Gacy case and the Norman trafficking ring. They knew about Paske and his role in both, yet they failed to connect the two. This linkage blindness is staggering. They treated Gacy like a homicide problem. They treated Norman as a CSAM problem, failing to see Philip Paske as the common denominator. The failure allowed the wider network to escape by the Gacy-centric prosecution. Decades after Gacy's 1994 execution, the case remains active. However, the focus of law enforcement, it's victim identification. It's not a criminal reinvestigation into accomplices or a trafficking network. The mission is to give Gacy's victims their names back using modern DNA technology and forensic investigative genetic genealogy. That's, where they use 23andMe to figure out who people are by relatives' DNA. Sheriff Dart's office has identified several victims who were buried without names in 1978. As of 2024, 5 victims remain unidentified. The sheriff's office continues to seek DNA samples from living family members who had male relatives go missing between 1970 and 1979, the period of Gacy's killing spree. The official focus remains solely on providing closure to the victims' families. The inability of the justice system to connect these disparate threads in the 1970s was a cultural failure. The Delta Network was an enterprise. It operated like a business, using card catalogs, newsletters, and middle management personnel like Philip Paske. The media's fixation on the killer clown of Gacy distracted from the corporate reality of their crimes. It was easier for society to believe in monsters than in a market. Further, the prevailing homophobia of the era played a significant role in the lack of investigation. Victims were dismissed as runaways or hustlers, and police didn't investigate crimes within the gay community with the same intensity as applied to other demographics. This marginalization created a gray zone where Norman's network could thrive. He was protected by the indifference of the state. The evidence shows that the crimes of John Wayne Gacy and Dean Corll connected through John David Norman. And this connection is solidified by the physical presence of Philip Paske, Norman's lieutenant and Gacy's employee. And it's corroborated by the testimony of accomplices regarding its syndicate, the discovery of victim photographs in commercial trafficking rings, and the admissions of Gacy himself. The Gacy trafficking theory argues that these men were not isolated, but they were operators within a shadow economy of exploitation. John David Norman provided the infrastructure, Philip Paske provided the logistical bridge, and Gacy and Corll provided the terminal violence. The John Wayne Gacy case needs to be viewed in a new light. It should not be seen as the result of an individual madman, but the product of a permissive environment created by organized trafficking networks. The 33 victims of Gacy were not just random targets. They were likely commodities in a system that viewed them as inventory. Justice for these young men require acknowledging not just the hands that killed them, but the network that delivered them to their executioners. Make sure that you're subscribed to this channel, The Spooky Lawyer. Make sure that you like, share, hype this video, and please leave a comment if you like the video. Follow me on Twitter, Blue Sky, and TikTok. My username is The Spooky Lawyer. If there's a spooky or disturbing story you would like me to cover, leave a comment and tell me about it, or send me an email. My email address is thespookyLawyer@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the channel, there is a link in the description and in my bio to buy me a coffee, and you can buy me a coffee. Or you can become a member of this channel, and for the $1.99 tier, you can get access to exclusive content, which includes exclusive videos, as well as access to my videos before they go public. I appreciate you considering this. You can also support me by clicking like, subscribing, sharing, and continuing to watch my videos. And I really do appreciate that you watch my videos. And please stay spooky.